During decades, military archives kept this story in total secrecy. No soldier who participated wanted to talk about what really happened that night in Saint-Dié-des-Vosges. But today, you're going to discover why. Before we begin, tell us in the comments where you're watching from and what time it is. And if you enjoy stories like this, subscribe to the channel for more daily documentaries. Ready? Now turn up the volume and let's begin. The first reports arrived at headquarters on November 14, 1944. Fragmentary radio transmissions, garbled by static and the chaos of combat. A small detachment from the 761st Tank Battalion had veered off their assigned route in the dense Vosges Mountains of northeastern France. The official mission was reconnaissance, to scout German positions beyond the town of Saint-Dié-des-Vosges. But what they discovered that foggy morning would remain classified for over 2 decades. Lieutenant James Hendricks led the patrol, a 26-year-old officer from Detroit, Michigan, whose personnel file noted his exceptional tactical awareness and steady temperament under fire. His commanding officers had selected him specifically for this mission, though the records do not indicate why. The detachment consisted of 2 Sherman tanks and 17 men, all African Americans serving in a segregated unit of the United States Army. The original orders, preserved in the National Archives, instructed Lieutenant Hendricks to proceed northwest along Route D, maintain radio silence except in emergency, and return to base by 1600 hours. No mention of prisoners. No indication they expected to find the abandoned church that had been converted into a makeshift detention facility. Sergeant William Coleman, the gunner in the lead tank, kept a personal journal that would later become crucial evidence when military historians began assembling the fragments of this story. His entry for that day reads, "Fog so thick we could barely see 20 yards ahead. Mountains all around us. Lieutenant H. kept checking his map, but I think we all knew we'd strayed off course when the road narrowed and turned to mud. Then we heard it. Voices. Not German, English, American English. What happened in the next 4 hours would challenge the deeply segregated structure of the American military. It would expose the contradictions of fighting for democracy abroad while discrimination flourished at home. And it would remain almost entirely unknown to the American public for more than 20 years. The prisoners were from the 28th Infantry Division, 36 white American soldiers captured during the brutal fighting in the Hürtgen Forest 3 weeks earlier. According to later debriefings, they had been transported to this temporary holding facility while awaiting transfer to a permanent POW camp deeper in German territory. Their guards, a small contingent of Wehrmacht soldiers, had apparently fled just hours before Lieutenant Hendricks and his men arrived, likely alerted to the approaching American forces. Private First Class Marcus Washington, the loader in the second tank, recounted the moment in an oral history interview conducted in 1967. "We approached cautiously. Could have been a trap. Lieutenant had us secure the perimeter before he ordered Corporal Jenkins to force open the church door. Inside were these men, Americans, in terrible condition, malnourished, exhausted, some wounded, and the looks on their faces when they saw us. First relief, then confusion, then something else I couldn't name at the time, but I understand it now." The official after-action report submitted by Lieutenant Hendricks mentions only that 36 American personnel were recovered and evacuated to division medical facilities. No mention of the tension that followed, no record of the words exchanged, but other accounts would eventually emerge. Captain Thomas Whitaker was the highest-ranking officer among the liberated prisoners. A 32-year-old West Point graduate from Virginia, whose family's military service dated back to the Revolutionary War. In his mandatory debriefing, he stated that the rescue operation was conducted with appropriate military efficiency. When asked specifically about the 761st Tank Battalion personnel, he replied only, "They performed their duty." But Sergeant Coleman's journal tells a different story. Some refused to move at first. One officer, a captain, asked if there were any real American units in the area. Lieutenant H just stared at him and said, "We're as American as you are, sir. Now let's get you men home." Military records confirm that 36 prisoners were successfully transported back to American lines that evening. All survived. All were eventually returned to the United States. None mentioned in their official statements the race of their rescuers. The 761st Tank Battalion would go on to distinguish itself throughout the European campaign, participating in 4 major Allied offensives and earning several unit citations. Yet this particular rescue mission remained absent from their official history. In 1948, President Harry Truman signed Executive Order 9981, officially desegregating the United States military. The 761st was disbanded, its members reassigned to various units. Lieutenant Hendricks left the Army and returned to Detroit, where he worked as a postal clerk until his death in 1963. He never spoke publicly about the events at Saint-Dié-de-Vosges. The true account of what happened that day might have remained buried in classified files and fading memories, if not for the persistence of one woman, Catherine Phillips, a journalist for the Chicago Defender who had covered the integration of the armed forces. In 1958, while researching a 10th anniversary piece on Truman's executive order, she discovered a brief reference to the rescue in a letter written by Corporal Robert Jenkins to his family. "The church was cold and damp," he had written. "The men inside looked half dead, but when they saw us coming through that door, black faces under army helmets, some of them couldn't believe it. One kept saying, 'They sent you for us,' like he couldn't make sense of it, but we got them out, all of them, whatever they thought of us, we got them home." Phillips began tracking down other members of the patrol. Some refused to speak with her. Others shared fragments of memory, details that aligned but had never been assembled into a complete narrative. She submitted Freedom of Information Act requests for the official records, but was repeatedly denied access due to ongoing security concerns. What exactly those security concerns entailed has never been fully explained. But in private correspondence discovered after her death, Phillips suggested that the military was reluctant to highlight instances where black soldiers had directly rescued white ones, particularly when the reactions of those rescued revealed the deep racial tensions within American society. In 1962, Phillips published a series of articles based on her incomplete research. They generated modest attention in the black press, but were largely ignored by mainstream news outlets. One reader, however, took particular notice, Dr. Martin Luther King Jr., who referenced the story in a speech at Howard University, noting that our black soldiers fought a double war against fascism abroad and racism at home. And then, in 1966, an unexpected development. Captain Thomas Whitaker, by then a retired colonel living in Richmond, Virginia, contacted Catherine Phillips. He requested a meeting, which she recorded with his permission. The transcript reveals a man struggling to reconcile his past actions with his evolving understanding of justice. "I was wrong," Whitaker told her. "When those men came through that door, Hendricks and his soldiers, I felt shame. Not because they were black, but because I recognized in that moment how deeply I had absorbed the prejudices of my upbringing. These men had risked their lives to save mine, and my first reaction was resentment that I owed my freedom to them." Whitaker explained that he had ordered the other prisoners not to mention the race of their rescuers in official debriefings. "I told myself it was to protect the unit from scrutiny. But I know now it was to protect myself from confronting what had happened, that I had failed as an officer and as a human being in that moment." The interview prompted Phillips to redouble her efforts to obtain the classified files. In 1967, with Whitaker's assistance, she finally gained limited access to the official records. What she found contradicted significant portions of the narrative that had been maintained for over 2 decades. Lieutenant Hendricks had not simply stumbled upon the church while on reconnaissance. According to intelligence reports, the detachment had been deliberately sent to investigate reports of American prisoners, though senior commanders later denied authorizing the mission. More significantly, Hendricks had disobeyed direct orders to maintain position and await reinforcement once the prisoners were located. Radio transcripts indicate that when Hendricks reported finding the prisoners, he was told to secure the area, but not to attempt evacuation. The battalion commander, concerned about potential German counterattacks and the lack of medical support, had dispatched a larger force, composed entirely of white soldiers from an attached infantry company, to complete the rescue. But Hendricks, assessing the deteriorating condition of the prisoners and intercepted German communications suggesting enemy forces were returning to the area, made the decision to evacuate immediately. In his final report, he wrote simply, "Tactical situation required immediate action to ensure survival of recovered personnel." This version of events, a black officer disobeying orders to save white soldiers, then being effectively erased from the official narrative, was far more problematic for the military hierarchy than a simple story of soldiers happening upon prisoners during a routine patrol. It raised uncomfortable questions about who was permitted to demonstrate heroism, whose judgment was trusted, and whose contributions were recognized. Help us bring this story to more people. Like the video, comment if you already knew about this case, and subscribe to the channel. Now, we return to the point where everything changed. The complete story might still remain fragmented and contested if not for the efforts of a young military historian named Dr. Benjamin Harrison. In 1968, while researching African-American military contributions for the Army Historical Division, he discovered a sealed file containing Lieutenant Hendricks' personal effects, which had been collected after his death and never returned to his family. Among them was a small leather-bound notebook, Hendricks' own journal, which he had kept in violation of security protocols. The entries were sporadic, often written in a hurried hand, but they provided crucial insights into the officer's thoughts during and after the rescue mission. November 15, 1944. One entry reads, "Command is displeased with yesterday's action. Major Roberts suggested I exceeded authority and risked valuable equipment. No mention of the men we saved. I reminded him that those were American soldiers. He said, of course they were. His emphasis, not mine." Another entry dated December 3rd reads, "Received letter from Captain Whitaker today. Formal, cold, acknowledges assistance rendered, but requests no further contact. Some gratitude. Coleman says I should have expected nothing more. Perhaps he's right, but I don't know what I thought." The most revealing entry came from March 1945, after the unit had participated in the crossing of the Rhine. "Spoke with General Patton during inspection today. He asked about Saint-Dié, said he'd heard about that church business, thought he might reprimand me for disobeying orders. Instead, he said, sometimes a man has to decide what kind of soldier he wants to be, one who follows orders or one who gets things done." Then he moved on. "First acknowledgement from any senior officer that what we did mattered." Dr. Harrison compiled these materials, along with interviews from surviving members of the 761st and the rescued prisoners, into a comprehensive report. But when he submitted it for publication in the Army's official historical series, he encountered significant resistance. Senior officials argued that the account was incomplete, unverifiable, and potentially divisive. In a memo discovered decades later, one colonel wrote, "While Harrison's research appears thorough, the publication of this particular incident serves no constructive purpose in documenting the Army's combat history. The focus on racial dynamics may undermine current integration efforts by reopening old wounds." Harrison refused to abandon the project. Instead, he shared his research with Catherine Phillips, who by then had established a reputation as an authority on African-American military history. Together, they prepared a manuscript that addressed not just the events at Saint-Dié-des-Vosges, but the subsequent suppression of the story. In the spring of 1969, as the civil rights movement continued to transform American society, Phillips and Harrison were finally ready to publish their findings. Then suddenly and mysteriously, key documents disappeared from Harrison's office at the Army Historical Division. His superiors suggested that he had been careless with classified materials. His security clearance was suspended pending investigation. Phillips, undeterred, prepared to publish what remained of their research. 3 days before her scheduled press conference, she received a visit from 2 men identifying themselves as Department of Defense officials. No record of this meeting exists in official files, but Phillips recounted it in a letter to her editor. They were polite but firm. They suggested that publication would violate security protocols and could result in legal action. When I pointed out that most of the material was over 20 years old and no longer sensitive, one of them said, "Mrs. Phillips, this isn't about military security, it's about national unity. Some stories, true as they may be, don't serve the greater good." Phillips cancelled the press conference. Harrison's security clearance was eventually restored, though he was reassigned to administrative duties and never returned to historical research. The manuscript they had prepared was secured in Phillips's personal files, with instructions that it not be published until after her death. Catherine Phillips died in 1977. In accordance with her wishes, her daughter waited 20 years before approaching publishers with the manuscript. By then, American society had changed. The military had nearly 3 decades of integration experience. The story of the Saint-Dié-des-Vosges rescue was finally published in 1997, 53 years after the events it described. The publication prompted the Army to release the remaining classified files related to the incident. Most were mundane: logistical reports, personnel records, equipment inventories. But one document stood out, a memorandum dated December 1944 from the Assistant Secretary of War to the Commanding General of European Operations. Incidents involving colored troops in non-standard roles should be documented with discretion, it read. While the contribution of all soldiers to the war effort is valued, public relations considerations require careful management of narratives that might complicate ongoing domestic discussions of race relations. Recommend minimal official recognition of the Saint-Dié incident pending further policy guidance. In 2001, a ceremony was held at Arlington National Cemetery honoring the men of Lieutenant Hendricks' detachment. 7 were still alive. None expressed bitterness about the decades of silence. Sergeant William Coleman, then 81, said simply, "We did what soldiers do. We brought our boys home." 5 of the rescued prisoners attended the ceremony. Among them was Thomas Whitaker, who had spent the intervening decades working for civil rights causes in his community. He embraced each of the surviving rescuers and presented them with a plaque he had commissioned. Its inscription read, "To the men who taught us that America's promise belongs to all who defend her." The full truth of what happened in that French church, the words exchanged, the tensions navigated, the courage displayed on both sides, may never be completely known. Those who were there carried their individual memories to their graves. The official record remains incomplete, shaped by the politics and prejudices of its time. But certain facts are beyond dispute. On a foggy November day in 1944, 17 black soldiers risked their lives to rescue 36 white Americans. They acted with courage and competence in the face of danger, and for their efforts, they were erased from history for more than half a century. The story of the Saint-Dié-des-Vosges rescue is more than an account of a single military operation. It is a testament to the complex relationship between service and citizenship, between sacrifice and recognition. It reminds us that history is not simply what happened, but what we choose to remember and what we choose to forget. In the decades since the events at Saint-Dié-des-Vosges, America has continued to wrestle with questions of race, equality, and belonging. Progress has been made, setbacks have occurred, the journey toward fulfilling the nation's founding promise of equality for all remains unfinished. But perhaps the most powerful legacy of Lieutenant Hendricks and his men is not the rescue itself, but what it represents. The possibility that in moments of extreme danger, when lives hang in the balance, human beings can transcend the prejudices they have been taught and see one another simply as people worthy of risk, worthy of sacrifice, worthy of remembrance. The church still stands in Saint-Dié-des-Vosges. Local residents know little of what happened there in November 1944. No plaque commemorates the American soldiers who met within its walls, neither those who were imprisoned nor those who set them free. It is, like so many sites of history, a place where momentous events occurred that left no visible trace. In 1968, shortly before the unexpected end of his research, Dr. Benjamin Harrison visited Saint-Dié-des-Vosges. He located the church and spent an afternoon sitting in its small courtyard, trying to imagine the scene that had unfolded there 24 years earlier. Before leaving, he wrote a final reflection in his research journal. What strikes me most about this story is not the dramatic rescue itself, but the quiet aftermath, the way these men carried their experience forward into lives of ordinary dignity. The prisoners who couldn't acknowledge their debt, the rescuers who couldn't claim their achievement, all of them bound together in a moment of truth they weren't permitted to speak. History is full of such silences, moments that changed those who lived them but never entered our collective memory. I wonder how many other such stories remain untold, waiting for someone to listen. Did you enjoy this story? Your support helps us continue producing new documentaries. A like, a comment, or a share makes all the difference. See more historical cases on our channel, and if you're not subscribed yet, join our community. I'll see you in the next episode.